Patricia didn't cry when she said it. There were no tears, no shaking hands, no long pause where she searched for the right words. She just stood in the middle of our living room, arms crossed, voice flat, and said it like she had been rehearsing it for weeks. "You need to leave, Daniel." Her mother, Vivian, stood behind her like a guard. She had never liked me, not from the very first dinner, not through any of the 30 years that followed. She stood there with her chin raised and her eyes cold, like a judge who had already decided the verdict before hearing a single word. Then came the blow I wasn't ready for. "Aaron needs us more," Patricia said, nodding toward her adult son from her first marriage. He was standing near the hallway, holding his young daughter against his chest. "You were never really family, Daniel. Not the way he is." Something dropped inside me. Not broke, dropped. Like a stone falling through still water. No splash. Just a quiet, sinking feeling deep in my chest. I thought about the roof I had repaired 3 winters ago. The debt I had quietly cleared so we could keep the house. The birthdays and sick nights and school runs I had showed up for without ever being asked. 30 years. And suddenly, none of it counted. I stood there and said nothing. They expected me to fight back. I could see it in the way Patricia kept glancing at her mother, waiting for the explosion. Vivian had her arms folded and her jaw tight, ready for me to raise my voice so she could step in and call me unreasonable. I didn't give them that. Instead, I stood still and looked at Aaron. He was staring at the floor. His little daughter had buried her face against his shoulder. He wouldn't look at me, not even once. That small, avoided moment told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a decision made today. This had been built slowly, quietly, in conversations I was never part of. Phone calls I wasn't meant to hear. Dinners I wasn't invited to. Plans discussed in rooms I was never allowed to enter. Vivian had always run this family from the shadows. She had a way of planting ideas in Patricia's mind and making them feel like Patricia's own thoughts. I had watched her do it for years, with money, with holidays, with where we lived and how we spent our weekends. I had let it go because I loved my wife. Standing there in my own living room, watching them both wait for my anger, I realized something that changed everything. My silence was confusing them far more than any anger could have. Patricia disappeared into the bedroom and came back holding a small brown suitcase. It was already packed. That detail hit me harder than anything she had said out loud. She had packed it before telling me. That meant the decision wasn't new. It wasn't made in a moment of emotion or sadness. This had been planned. The bag was ready before the conversation even began. "You'll be okay," she said, holding it out toward me. Her voice was soft, like she was doing me a kindness. Like handing a man his own suitcase and asking him to leave the home he helped build was somehow a generous and caring act. Vivian stepped forward and added, "It's time you let real family take priority." Real family. I took the suitcase from Patricia's hands. It was light. Lighter than I expected for 30 years of a shared life. A few clothes, some personal items, nothing more. Everything else, the furniture, the photographs in the hallway, the garden I had planted by hand, stayed behind. I walked toward the front door slowly. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said wait or let's talk or maybe we're rushing this. Aaron still hadn't looked up from the floor. I almost said something. Instead, I opened the door, stepped out into the cold evening air, and heard it close firmly behind me. That quiet click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 56 years old. I spent most of my working life in commercial property finance. Not glamorous work, not the kind of career that gets talked about at dinner parties or written about in business magazines. But it was steady work, and it taught me things that most people never bother to learn. How money moves, where it hides, how quickly it disappears when the wrong people are making decisions about it. Patricia and I met when I was 24. She was 22. We built something together over 3 decades, or at least I believed we did. I paid bills without complaint. I fixed things around the house. I showed up. I was the kind of man who never asked for recognition because I assumed love kept its own accounts. Vivian never approved of me. Not because I was a bad husband or a careless person, but because I wasn't easy to control. I had my own quiet opinions, my own careful plans, my own money sitting in places she didn't know about. That bothered her more than she ever admitted out loud. What none of them understood, what they never once thought to ask, was what a quiet man actually does with his time and his energy when nobody is watching. They assumed I was ordinary. That assumption was the most expensive mistake they ever made. I drove to a motel on the edge of town that night. Nothing fancy, a single room with a thin mattress and a heater that clicked every few minutes like it was trying to say something. I sat on the edge of the bed in my coat for a long time without turning on the television. I wasn't in shock. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected grief, the kind that crashes over you all at once and takes your breath completely away. Instead, what came was something quieter. A long, slow unraveling of every memory I had been holding onto. Every moment I had told myself things were fine when they clearly weren't. The trip Vivian had convinced Patricia to take without me. The family discussions I was never included in. The way Aaron had started appearing at our house more and more over the past 2 years, until it felt like he was already moving himself in long before I had moved myself out. I let myself feel all of it. The embarrassment. The loneliness. The particular sting of being pushed aside by people you gave everything to without thinking twice. Then I lay back on that thin mattress and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder and far more useful than anger. I felt completely clear. And clarity, I have learned over 56 years, is the most powerful thing a quiet man can carry into any situation. Patricia always assumed I spent most of my salary on the house and on keeping the family comfortable. Vivian believed the same thing without ever questioning it. They never looked closely at my accounts, never showed any real interest in my finances beyond what directly affected their own plans. That was their first and most costly mistake. I had been investing quietly for over 15 years. Not in anything unpredictable, in property. Small parcels of land in growing areas. Distressed homes in mid-sized cities. A couple of storage facilities that performed reliably year after year. Modest things, bought carefully and held patiently through a holding company I had set up early in my finance career. The company was registered under a professional name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know exactly what to look for. My income from those investments had grown steadily over the years. Not dramatically or in a way that would cause anyone to notice or ask questions. But steadily and reliably, the way a river slowly carves through rock, quietly and without announcement, until the canyon is already there and the work is already done. I had never shown Patricia these accounts. Not out of dishonesty. I had simply learned early in our marriage that anything I shared with her eventually became something Vivian had strong opinions about. So I kept it quietly separate. Lying on that motel mattress, I was deeply grateful that I had. Patricia had insisted we move to Clover Ridge 7 years ago. It was Vivian's idea originally, of course it was. A gated neighborhood on the north side of the city, full of large houses, carefully trimmed lawns, and people who spent far more on appearances than on actual financial stability. I had agreed because I loved my wife. But I had also studied the neighborhood the way I studied every potential property situation, carefully, without emotion, looking beneath the surface at what the numbers were actually saying. What I found had never entirely left the back of my mind. Clover Ridge looked wealthy. But it wasn't. Most of the homes were financed right to their limits. The expensive renovations people were so proud of, paid for with high-interest personal loans. The new cars sitting in every driveway? Leased, not owned. The perfect lawns, the fresh exterior paint, the outdoor kitchens, all of it resting on a foundation of borrowed money and borrowed time, held together by the shared understanding that nobody was supposed to look too closely. I had kept that knowledge quietly in the back of my mind the way you keep a spare key, not because you plan to use it immediately, but because it is good to know it is there. Sitting in that motel room, I pulled out a small notebook and began writing down street addresses. I was simply starting to pay closer attention to something I had already noticed. 3 weeks after I left the house, a property on Clover Ridge came up for a private sale. Not listed publicly, I found it through a contact I had built over many years of careful work in property finance. A small home near the far end of the street. The owner had fallen behind on payments and needed a fast, quiet sale to avoid the full weight of foreclosure proceedings landing on him publicly. The price was well below market value. I made the purchase through my holding company, a business I had registered years earlier under the name Stepchild Properties. Clean, fully legal, documented properly at every step. Nobody in the neighborhood would connect that name to me unless they already knew what to look for and where to search. I used a local property manager to handle everything on the ground. A careful, professional man named Olu who had worked with me on 2 earlier projects and understood without being told that I valued complete discretion above all else. The paperwork was signed on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell a single person. I drove past the house later that evening and parked briefly on the street. The garden was overgrown. One gutter was hanging loose from the fascia. It needed work, but the structure underneath was solid. What mattered wasn't the house itself. What mattered was where it sat, and who was living nearby. I was careful about how often I drove through Clover Ridge. Not so often that anyone would notice a pattern, but regularly enough to watch the neighborhood the way I had always watched potential investments, with patience, attention, and no rush to act before the full picture became clear. I saw Patricia twice in those early weeks. Once from a distance, carrying grocery bags from her car to the front door. Once closer as she walked Aaron's daughter toward a neighbor's home. She looked tired. Not the tired of a woman enjoying her new freedom, but the specific tired of someone who is carrying more weight than she had prepared herself for. Aaron's car was parked outside nearly every day now. A second car I didn't recognize appeared regularly too, a young woman who arrived with expensive-looking bags and left without them. The house next door to Patricia's, owned by a retired couple named the Browers, had a pale blue notice tucked into the mailbox slot one weekday morning. I couldn't read it clearly from the street, but I had worked in property finance long enough to recognize the color and format of that kind of document without needing to see the words. Unpaid. Overdue. Urgent. I wrote the Browers' address in my notebook. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was watching where trouble was already quietly beginning to grow on its own. Word moves carefully in the right professional circles, and I had spent 30 years building relationships inside those circles. A contact at a local title company. A lawyer I had done business with off and on for a decade. A property assessor who occasionally shared general market observations over a relaxed lunch. None of them knew the full picture. Each one knew only their own small piece. Through those conversations, the pieces began fitting together. Aaron had borrowed money from 3 separate sources in the past 12 months alone. One was a personal loan. One was a credit line drawn against a small property he co-owned with Patricia. The third was an informal arrangement with a family friend that had already gone badly sideways. His daughter's medical needs were real and ongoing. I never doubted that for a moment, and I felt no resentment toward the child. But Aaron's spending reached far beyond those needs. New furniture for the house. A vacation he posted about on social media for days. Equipment for a business idea he had not yet formally started. Patricia was quietly covering shortfalls. I could see it in small signs. Her car hadn't been serviced in months, and the broken outdoor porch light I had noticed weeks ago still hadn't been fixed. She was holding everything together with both hands stretched wide. And both hands were beginning to shake visibly at the edges. The second property came 6 weeks after the first. An older couple 2 houses down from Patricia had decided to leave the neighborhood entirely. Their children had been living in another state for years and had been asking them to move closer for a long time. They wanted a fast, clean, private sale. No open houses, no real estate agents bringing unfamiliar people through their rooms every weekend, no drawn-out process. Olu made the approach on my behalf. A fair offer, slightly below asking price, but with a quick close and no complications or conditions attached. They agreed within 2 days. Stepchild Properties now owned 2 homes on Clover Ridge. I had both professionally assessed, had minor repairs completed quietly, and arranged for clean, professional rental management. The tenants who eventually moved into each home were ordinary, decent people who paid on time and kept the gardens presentable. From the outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. But I could already feel the change, the way a room changes temperature when someone opens a window in another part of the house. You don't see it immediately. You simply begin to notice that something feels different from how it felt before. A neighborhood is only as stable as the people holding it together financially. Remove enough of those anchor points, and the whole social landscape begins to shift in ways that are difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Clover Ridge was beginning to shift, and only I understood why. The missed payments started showing up publicly in early spring. Not just rumors passed between people, actual documentation that my professional contacts were able to locate through public records and quiet, lawful channels. 3 households on Clover Ridge had fallen behind on their mortgage payments by more than 90 days. In the lending world, 90 days is the line that changes everything. Once a borrower crosses it, the available options narrow quickly and the pressure builds in ways that are very difficult to reverse without serious help. One of those households was 2 houses away from Patricia. Another was directly across the street from her front door. The third, and this was the one that made me pause longest, had Aaron's name attached to a joint loan document. A property he had co-signed with Patricia 3 years ago. A property I had not known existed until that exact moment. I sat with that piece of information for a long time. It meant she wasn't just helping Aaron from her personal savings. She had legally tied herself to his debt. Her name was attached to an obligation she apparently hadn't mentioned to me, or perhaps hadn't fully understood the weight of when she originally agreed to it. This was no longer simply about Aaron making one poor decision after another. This was about a financial structure that was cracking from several different directions at once. And cracks, once they start spreading, rarely stop on their own. She saw me on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. I was standing outside the first property I had purchased, speaking with Olu about a plumbing repair that needed attention before new tenants moved in the following month. We were both looking down at a clipboard when I heard the sound of footsteps on the pavement slowing and then stopping nearby. I looked up. Patricia was standing about 10 meters away. She had been walking back from somewhere. Her hands held a canvas shopping bag and she was wearing sunglasses pushed up on her forehead. I could see the exact moment she recognized me. Her face did something complicated and layered all at once. Shock came first. Then something harder to name, not quite anger, not quite guilt. Something closer to the expression of a person who has just noticed a piece of furniture they donated sitting in someone else's front room, looking better than it ever did in theirs. I nodded at her politely. She didn't nod back. She stared for a moment, then quickened her pace and walked past without speaking. Olu glanced over at me. "Someone you know?" "Someone I used to," I said simply. We went back to the clipboard. But I had seen something in her face that stayed with me through the rest of the afternoon. She wasn't just surprised to see me standing there. She was unsettled. And she didn't yet understand why. 6 weeks after she saw me outside that house, a formal letter arrived at Patricia's address. I hadn't sent it personally. It came from a property management firm, a firm that Carterfield Properties occasionally worked alongside, regarding a neighborhood-wide property review process and a discussion about long-term value maintenance across Clover Ridge for all current residents. The letter was professional and measured. Nothing in it was alarming on the surface. It simply requested a brief, optional meeting to discuss the changing ownership landscape in the neighborhood and what it might mean for current homeowners over the coming years. It was exactly the kind of letter that, if you understood property law and neighborhood finance, would make the back of your neck prickle just slightly. Most people in Clover Ridge set it aside or ignored it entirely after a quick read. Patricia, according to Olu, put hers in a kitchen drawer. Vivian, who had been spending more and more time at the house as Aaron's situation became increasingly stressful, apparently told Patricia not to concern herself. "Management firms send letters like this all the time," she reportedly said with complete confidence. "It doesn't mean a thing. File it and forget it." That certainty, so calm, so completely dismissive, was so typical of Vivian that it almost made me smile when I heard about it. She had spent her entire life believing she could see trouble coming before it arrived. She had no idea she was already standing directly inside it. Vivian had a gift for making everyone around her feel that she was the most capable person in any room. Patricia had grown up completely inside that belief, had been shaped by it in ways she probably didn't fully understand even now. Vivian controlled situations by always being the one with the plan. The one who stayed calm when others panicked. The one who looked you in the eye and said don't worry, and somehow made that sound like wisdom instead of blindness. I had watched her do it for 30 years from close range. When Aaron's first serious financial problem had surfaced about 2 years ago, before the separation, while I was still living in the house, Vivian had stepped in without hesitation. "We'll handle it as a family," she had said firmly. "That's what real family does." I had offered to help at the time. Not because I owed Aaron anything, but because I genuinely believed in household stability. Vivian had declined my offer with a thin, controlled smile and said simply that it was already being taken care of. What she meant was, "This does not involve you." What she was really saying underneath that was, "We don't trust you with this." So now, as the pressure inside Clover Ridge continued building quietly toward something real, Vivian's unwavering confidence wasn't reassurance for the people around her. It was her most serious weakness. She had never once considered me a factor worth accounting for. By midsummer, Carterfield Properties held 5 homes inside Clover Ridge. Not the largest homes on the street. Not the ones with the biggest lawns or the most recently renovated kitchens. The ones that mattered strategically, properties positioned near key intersections within the neighborhood, near the shared private road that ran through its center, near the small common area residents used regularly. In property work, position matters more than size. I had known that for 30 years. I also had 2 more homes under contract at that point, meaning the paperwork was progressing smoothly and both purchases would close within 60 days. One was the former home of the Browers, the retired couple whose pale blue legal notice I had spotted in their mailbox months earlier. They had accepted Olu's offer quietly and relocated to their daughter's city without making any announcement to their neighbors. Another family had also decided to sell privately, a younger couple who had bought into Clover Ridge at the height of the market and could no longer hold the mortgage after an unexpected job loss. They were genuinely relieved to have a buyer who moved at their pace, asked no difficult questions, and handled everything cleanly. Carterfield Properties was becoming something real inside this neighborhood. Not the dominant owner yet, but enough. Enough to matter when things began to collapse. Enough to have a legitimate seat at any table that might eventually form around the neighborhood's future. I was no longer watching from a comfortable distance. Aaron's next significant mistake didn't require any assistance from me. He had been speaking to people for several months about a business idea, a logistics and delivery company of some kind. The details shifted every time the story passed from one person to another, but the core of it stayed consistent. He needed outside investors. He was confident in the concept. He had a solid plan. What he didn't have was any verifiable track record, a properly registered business, or any real working knowledge of how the industry he was entering actually operated day to day. But he had confidence, and to certain kinds of people, confidence looks enough like competence to become genuinely dangerous. He secured a loan from a private lender. A significant one. The interest rate was high, the repayment window was short, and the collateral was attached directly to the joint property he shared with Patricia. I heard about it through my title company contact 3 weeks after the documents were signed. I didn't interfere in any way. I didn't make any calls. I simply noted the date of signing, the name of the lender, and the total amount, and I added the information quietly to the file I had been building. The loan would come due in 14 months. Aaron's business had not moved beyond a name and a logo designed by a friend on a home computer. Some people create their own disasters so efficiently that nothing else is required from anyone. You simply stand back and let the numbers do what numbers always eventually do. By early autumn, the legal notices had multiplied across the neighborhood. They arrived from several directions at once, the kind of layered financial pressure that doesn't look like one clear problem when you're standing inside it, but feels like 20 smaller ones pulling in slightly different directions until you cannot move effectively in any of them. A routine county reassessment notice had gone out to every homeowner in Clover Ridge as part of a standard annual update process. In a financially healthy market, these notices are unremarkable and barely worth reading carefully. But in a neighborhood where most owners were already stretched thin and operating close to their limits, even a modest upward adjustment in assessed value, which directly affects annual property taxes, was enough to push several households into genuine difficulty. 2 families listed their properties within a single month of receiving those notices. 1 home entered formal pre-foreclosure proceedings. Public record, available to anyone with access to the right databases. Olu called me on a Friday morning to share an update. His voice was professionally steady as always, but even he noted that the tone of the neighborhood had changed noticeably in recent weeks. "People are talking," he said. "What are they saying?" I asked. "That things are tightening. That some of the newer ownership in the area might be connected somehow. That the neighborhood is changing faster than they expected." I thanked him and ended the call. The neighborhood wasn't simply changing. It was waking up to something it had never thought to prepare for. She came to me on a Sunday afternoon in October. Not to the motel. I had moved into a modest rental apartment by then, a clean 2-bedroom on the quieter side of the city. She found the address through a mutual friend, one of the few people who had stayed quietly in contact with both of us since the separation. She knocked 3 times. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the specific way a person looks when something they were completely certain about has started coming apart at the seams. I stepped back and let her in without a word. She sat at the small table near the window. She kept her coat on. She looked around the apartment briefly, a quick, involuntary survey of the space, and then looked back at me with her hands folded on the table. "Things are changing in the neighborhood," she said carefully. "Properties selling. New management companies appearing. Legal notices going out to homeowners. People don't understand what's driving it." I said nothing. "Do you know anything about what's happening?" she asked. "You worked in property finance for most of your career. You must have heard something through your old contacts." I looked at her for a long time. Long enough for her to shift slightly in her seat. Long enough for the silence itself to become a kind of answer. Then I said, quietly and without any drama at all, "More than you think, Patricia." She went home and started searching. I had fully expected that. Patricia was not a careless or unintelligent woman. Her mistake had never been a lack of ability. It had been misplaced trust, in Vivian's judgment, in Aaron's intentions, in a version of her future that looked safer and simpler than the one she had actually been building. But once she started looking, she was methodical about it. Careful and thorough in a way I recognized and, in some private part of myself, respected. It took her 9 days. She called me on a Tuesday evening. I let it ring twice before answering. "Carterfield Properties," she said. Her voice was composed and controlled, but I could hear something moving underneath it, the distinct sound of a person who has just watched the ground shift beneath their feet without warning. I said nothing and let her continue. "I found the name," she said. "I looked up the ownership records for the homes that have been sold recently inside the neighborhood. Multiple properties, all registered to the same holding company. Carterfield." Still nothing from me. "Carter," she said more quietly. "As in Daniel Carter." I heard her exhale slowly and steadily. "Is this you?" she asked. The question hung in the air between us. I did not confirm it. I did not deny it. I simply said, "Come to the apartment tomorrow. Bring Vivian if you feel you need to." I think it's time we had a genuinely honest conversation. Then I ended the call, made myself a cup of tea, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The 2 weeks that followed were where everything Patricia had been quietly holding together finally gave way completely. Aaron's private lender made formal contact. The business had produced nothing in the time since the loan was signed. No registered clients, no documented revenue, no credible evidence of real progress in any direction. The lender had included a clause in the original agreement that allowed them to demand early repayment if the business showed no measurable activity within a defined period. Aaron had apparently signed that clause without reading it carefully enough to understand what it meant. The demand letter was sent to the address on file, which was Patricia's house. The joint property they had put up as collateral was suddenly at serious and immediate legal risk. Patricia called me the day the letter arrived, and for the first time since our separation, Her voice carried something I hadn't heard in it before. Real fear. Not the managed kind. The unguarded kind that surfaces when a person realizes the people they trusted most with important decisions had been making those decisions with their eyes only half open. Vivian worked urgently to manage the situation. She made calls, arranged a meeting with a lawyer, insisted firmly that solutions existed. But even Vivian could not restructure a demand letter from a private lender who held every legal right to enforce exactly what Erin had voluntarily signed. For the first time in 30 years of watching her operate, Vivian ran completely out of moves. She went quiet, and her silence told me more than any of her words ever had. She didn't come alone. I had told her she could bring Vivian, and she did. They arrived at my apartment on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the city looks tired and flat. Vivian walked in first, out of lifelong habit, always the one to enter a room ahead of everyone else, always positioning herself naturally at the center. But she didn't sit at the head of the table this time. She sat where I quietly indicated, in the chair nearest the door. Patricia sat beside her. Erin had not come. I hadn't expected him to, and I hadn't asked. Patricia spoke first. "We're in trouble, Daniel." There was no performance in it. No careful framing, no attempt to minimize or redirect the conversation before it began. "The lender is serious and moving quickly. The assessment notices have raised our taxes beyond what we were planning for. And there are things I didn't know, things Erin chose not to tell me, about how the money was structured from the beginning." She paused. "We need help," she said. That particular word sat in the room between us for a long moment. It was the same word they had used the night they pushed me out of the house I had helped build. Real family was what Vivian had said then. And we had not included me at all. Now it did. I looked at them both carefully. I felt no desire to twist the moment into something cruel. I simply asked, "What kind of help are you looking for?" I laid everything out on the table between us. Not to punish them, to make sure we were all finally speaking the same honest language, possibly for the first time in years. Carter Field Properties. The purchases. The legal channels I had used. Every acquisition documented cleanly and thoroughly at every step. I walked them through it slowly, using plain and direct language, giving them time to absorb each piece before moving to the next. Patricia's face moved through several layers, surprise, then recognition, then something that looked almost like a quiet understanding of how things had actually unfolded. Vivian sat very still throughout. She had the particular look of a person who has just realized they have been playing chess against someone they had assumed didn't know the rules. "I didn't take anything from either of you," I said when I had finished. "I didn't interfere with your lives, break any agreement, or cause a single thing that has happened in this neighborhood. I simply stopped letting my money sit still, and I started paying proper attention to what was already in front of me." I paused and let that settle. "You built something on borrowed money and borrowed time," I continued. "I didn't build that. Erin didn't build it either. You built it, both of you, together, one decision at a time." Vivian opened her mouth once, then quietly closed it. That was the moment I had waited 30 years to see. Vivian, without a single word to offer. Patricia looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she looked back at me. "What happens now?" she asked. I had thought about this part carefully. Not in anger. Not with the satisfaction of someone waiting to take something back in one large, dramatic moment. That kind of thinking belongs to people who are still bleeding, and I had done most of my grieving alone in a cheap motel room on a cold night many months ago. What I had thought about instead was fairness, structure, and the kind of man I intended to be when all of this was fully behind me. I told them the terms. Carter Field Properties would not pursue foreclosure on the property tied to Erin's failed loan. I would offer a formal restructuring arrangement that gave Patricia the time needed to resolve that debt without losing the asset entirely or facing public proceedings. But there were clear conditions attached. Erin would have no further financial involvement in any property connected to Patricia's name without independent legal documentation and a proper third-party review. That condition was not negotiable under any circumstances. Vivian would carry no authority over any financial decision affecting Patricia's household from this point forward. She was welcome to remain part of the family's life if Patricia chose that. But she would no longer run the room from behind the scenes. Aunt Patricia and I would sit together with a neutral mediator to formally separate every financial tie still connecting us. Completely, cleanly, without confusion or loose ends. No shouting. No public scenes. No punishment beyond what reality had already provided on its own. Just terms. Legal, fair, and completely final. Spring came slowly that year. The kind that begins cold and gray and then opens all at once when you are not quite expecting it. The sky clearing before you have fully prepared yourself for the light. Clover Ridge looked the same from the outside. Same houses, same trimmed lawns, same quiet streets in the early morning hours. But underneath the surface, everything was different from what it had been. Carterfield Properties now held 7 homes in the neighborhood. A professional management company ran each one responsibly and fairly. Good tenants. Honest rents. Well-maintained buildings that added to the neighborhood rather than draining it. Patricia had accepted the restructuring terms. The joint debt was being resolved on a schedule she could actually manage. Aaron had moved out of her house about 6 weeks after our Thursday morning meeting, quietly, without confrontation. His daughter went with him. I wished them both well, privately and without bitterness. The child had done absolutely nothing wrong. Vivian had not returned to the house since that gray morning in my apartment. Perhaps she would eventually. That was not my concern anymore. I did not rebuild my relationship with Patricia. Some things, once they have been taken apart and honestly examined, don't need to be reassembled. They simply need to be resolved cleanly so that both people can walk forward without the weight of unfinished business pulling at them. I was not the man they had quietly decided didn't matter. I was the man who had been paying careful attention the entire time. I had simply waited for the right moment to let that mean something.